Welcome back to DJ Tutorials, everybody. And here we have the requested scene breakdown of the abstract logo animation that I did with the render comparisons. And I'll probably do a very quick version of like maybe 3 to 5 minutes with just music playing and just sped up footage, maybe. I'm not really sure. But this video is specifically for people who are really interested in actually seeing how this is done and understanding sort of like the principles behind it. So it's kind of broken down into 9 different sort of, I don't know, parts or something like that, as far as like from beginning to end, including all the compositing like layers and everything that was done. And I'm not going to be going over how to actually transfer your materials over to the different render engines. That's probably best left for a, totally separate video. But I'm going to do my best to explain how I made this scene and how I rendered it and composited it as quickly as possible, but also with enough information for you to actually know what's going on. So I am inside of Blender now, and I'm just taking a quick look at, or we are just going to take a quick look at how the scene was made. So I'm going to turn off everything except for the logo, which is this rounded cube right here. So if I go into edit mode, you can see that it's a rounded cube. It's not a UV sphere, and if you really want to know why I use that, and if you just want more general information of how I kind of build objects, you can see my tutorial series for beginners on creating basic geometrics. But basically what we have here is a rounded sphere, and I mapped, let me turn the lamps on real quick, and you'll just have to deal with the background being there for now since I'm using Eevee. Let's see, actually rendered it can get rid of it. So you can see here, basically, it's just an image map, which is my logo, and it's just UV mapped to this rounded cube. And I have 4 different spot lamps that are put throughout the scene. And if I open up the materials right here, basically, I just used a uh, roughness map and a normal map that I got from Texture Haven just to add some sort of like surface texturing and all that, just to make it a little bit more interesting than it being just like a shiny ball or anything like that. So very simple, very basic, not a whole lot going on there. So hopefully that's going to suffice anybody who's curious about this. Now the gyro is a bit more complex. And for just the purposes of showing you how this is done, I'm just going to turn off a couple of these things here. And we'll talk about just the shape itself. And if I zoom in on it, you can see it's basically just it's just like a ring that has a little bit of added geometry, just to give it a little bit of extra, um, detail. And it's then I added a bevel to it. I added an edge split and subdivisions, and then you get more of a sort of like rounded um, ring shape here. And what's mapped to it is an image map that I actually made, and let me open it up here. Actually, we can see it inside of the materials view, so let's just look at it through there, so I don't have to open up all these other things and waste everybody's time. So let's see here. All right. So here's the image that I basically created, and I used a vector program like Inkscape or Illustrator if you end up having that. Basically made this ring shape and used that to then colorize the metallic. So the white would be the metal and the black would be a non-metal. And I wanted to kind of have a little bit of a sort of like a painted metal look for those the hash marks and the uh, numbers themselves. And then the coloring, which it looks like here, I just ended up going with a straight color here. And those are then mapped into here. And that's why you end up getting this sort of look here. So the image here, I ended up using in conjunction with this ambient occlusion image map that I got from Texture Haven. And that is this sort of scratchy look here. And I use that to mix together and make the bump map, which then went over the top of our, or it went mapped onto our object here. So that's basically the breakdown of those materials and how I did that aspect of it. Now, the more interesting part, or at least what I think is the more interesting part, is how you actually get this to be multiple um, objects and how you can kind of control that. So let's just go into the solid view here, and you'll notice that I have some empties here that are doing some things. And if you have just your object here, you can rotate it and move it around. That's all fine. But when you start to, do more complex animations and you start doing other stuff, you want to start using empties and sort of like parenting objects to it or um, using them to do or control other things within your scene. So that's why I have these empties here. And I'm going to turn off the subdivision and turn on the array. And I'm going to move the count down to just a few. And normally, if you guys use an array, it's probably done like this with a relative offset. So you have, this sort of thing going on here for whatever it is that you're making. Now, the other thing you can do is you can actually use an object to create an offset. And what I did was I used this array, I called it an array control. I use this empty to change the scaling, which every time there's another array unit that's sort of like popped out, it will then like kind of duplicate or add more to that scaling or rotation or whatever it is that you put to it. So whatever you control from here will actually sort of like make the other objects not so much move in unison, but they will kind of move at different sort of speeds as you rotate and scale your object. And if you move it, you can actually change where those array where the arrays are sort of placed. And again, rotating it will make them act a certain way. So that's how all of these different gyros, if I add a whole bunch of them here, which I think in the end there was like 35 or something. So there's a whole bunch of these guys. And the more that you change this array control or rotate it or whatever, you can see that everything else sort of like, as it gets wider and wider, it kind of moves faster. And you can kind of make some really interesting shapes with this. And sort of like what I wanted to do for a while now is just make a really fun sort of like um, animation where these really fun shapes were sort of being made. Now I didn't do anything like this on this one because I just didn't want to do it, but I find stuff like this really really fun to do and to play with. And you can do all kinds of cool stuff. You can make unique designs. So if you go in here and you grab something and move it around, you can see that you're sort of like changing the shape um, as the array is sort of like done. So you can have like animated shape keys. You can do all kinds of cool stuff with this. And overall, I think it only took me, I think, like 2 or 3 hours to do the overall animation and texturing and shading and all that kind of stuff from beginning to end. So it was kind of like a quick thing to throw together. Because really the test for this was the render engines. But you can get some really cool shapes just by using these object offsets and getting them to like sort of line up and then rotating it out and animating it in all sorts of different fun ways and just like sort of creatively playing with those shapes. So that's basically how that was done. I have another gyro control here, which is basically just that the gyro itself is just parented to this larger empty. So if I wanted to rotate this around the z-axis or something like that, I can do that there, which is basically what I did. And that's how that animation was done for the gyro. The next thing that we'll talk about here is we'll take a look at the camera animation, and I'll just kind of keep that open by itself. Oh, we're upside down here, so let's get right side up. So here's my camera. It's on this circular track here, and it's it has some constraints here to follow a path, so you can animate where it's located on this actual curve path, and then you can animate the path itself to make it kind of a smoother, easier transition. You can also scale it in to bring the camera closer and all that. And the camera also has a focus that I use this empty for here. And basically, wherever the camera goes or wherever this empty goes, the camera will always track to it. So this empty was put towards the center, and then the focus for um, the focus for this could be set on that empty as well. I ended up just putting it on the sphere that was in there, but you could make the focus for the depth of field also tracked to that. And if you really want to know how to do this, I cover this in my Blender Basics tutorial series. It hasn't come out yet as of the time that this is released, but you will in that series on basic geometric compositions, it does cover how to deal with the camera and setting the camera to track to an object and stuff like that. So you can look forward to watching that. The next thing that I'll briefly talk about is how it's composited inside of Blender. Everything that is rendered out of the engines themselves is just the objects. The background is not rendered. So I handle the background and a background replacement for each and every render that I did, and that was to keep sort of like consistency, but also to reduce the amount of time for each frame rendered because you don't have to worry about rendering all that background stuff. Speaking of the background, um, this background was generated from this procedural nebula that you can find on Blendswap, and I'll put the link in the description below. Really, really awesome session that this person made. You could basically make a whole bunch of different types of nebula and environment scenes, and then what I did was I basically created a HDRI map of that scene. If you guys want, I can do a tutorial on how to do that. And then use that as an environment map inside of my scenes. So that's basically how that was done. And you could see here, you could do all kinds of different stuff with this thing, and it's pretty great. And I actually use this in the video that I showed for my top 7 uh, software for creatives. There's a project in there that I have a little spaceship that's kind of like flying, and I actually used this same background for that scene for illuminating the background and using it as a background. So, pretty wonderful tool and very great for like backgrounds and space scenes and stuff like that. So, I highly recommend doing that. Even though it was made for an older version of uh, Blender, you can still use it in 2.8. So going back to the compositing, basically it's just your image, your alpha channel, and your depth channel that's put into this composite node. And for the output, I use OpenEXR and set it to float full, which basically means if you don't know what the difference between float and integers are, basically float means that um, it holds a lot more information to keep it nice and simple. Integer is like 1, 2, 3, 4, and float is like basically anything in between. So like you know anything between 1 and 2 and any of those other integer values. So then for the codec, I just kept it on a lossless codec here, which is just this zip here, and that's basically what I did is I exported a bunch of EXRs. So they are very large files. So if you're doing this, just be aware of that. But this is the best way to sort of retain a lot of your color and luminance values without it becoming compressed. So EXR is a really great format for you to do that in. Okay, so the next thing is that we need to jump into Natron, which is the compositing program that I use. And I cover it very briefly in my top 7 uh, programs for creatives or top 7 software. And it's basically it mimics Nuke. It's an open source version of Nuke, which is a very expensive compositing program that uses this node based way of doing things. And learning this software is really great because it's almost a one-to-one match with Nuke. Most of these nodes are very basic when it comes to compositing, and if you learn how to do this and do it well, you can basically get a really decent job doing compositing work in the industry if that's what you want to do. But for other people who don't necessarily want to do that and you want to do this on your own projects and all that, it works great for that as well. It's, in my opinion, faster than Blender, and it's easier to see what's going on, and you have a lot more versatility in here. What all of these are here are basically all my different renders, and I attempted to do a color correct to try and get them a little bit closer to each other as far as the overall coloring, but it is very, very difficult to get a one-to-one match between the render engines. It's almost like a fool's errand to even try to do that. They just handle things very differently, or not very differently, but differently enough to where it's like noticeable and very hard to sort of like get a one-to-one match. So I don't think that's really why people come here, is to see if they can match it 100%. And to be honest, it's not really worth my time to do that. It's kind of monotonous and tedious and boring. Um, but still, you can see that each one has its own merits for how it uh, calculates and renders a scene. So that was kind of the first step here, was this color correction. Then we needed to do what's called a light wrap. So I'm just going to view through here. And a light wrap is basically whenever you're doing a comp where you are taking a foreground element and putting it over a background, especially green screen and stuff like that, what you need to do is make sure that some of that background is being portrayed into the foreground by, this sort of like glow effect here. And I'll just show you what it looks like without it. So you can see right here, there's no glow effect that's added to it. And then if I turn it on, you can see that there's this sort of like glow effect on the edges. And what it's actually doing is it's pulling in the background here that I blurred. And then it is sort of like taking that to create this, what's called a light wrap around the edges. And it will help to blend it into the scene a little bit better. And I'll show you what I mean. So if I go here, which is where the background is being put into the scene, you can see the background is now filling in all of the empty spaces here. If I zoom it into this area here and I turn off the light wrap, you can see that now it has this more harsh edge. You can see this more harsh edges that are put in here. But if I turn on the light wrap, it softens that edge so that it feels like it's more blended into the scene. So that's one way to sort of trick the eye into thinking that this was actually in that scene. So the next thing that you'll want to do, and I have a pretty high-powered computer, and some of this stuff takes a while to handle, or render. If you have a kind of not as good computer, just keep in mind you might have to do a couple different sort of like um, uh, pre-comp renders and then pipe those into each other. I'm not going to do a whole course on this right now. I'll probably do it later. Um, but just keep in mind that you probably won't be able to do all of this stuff on your computer unless you have a pretty high-powered computer. And this is a 2K render, so just keep that in mind. Especially 4K, it's almost like it's a real pain. There are ways to make it easier, but I'm not going to go into that right now. So the next thing that was done is we made a glow map. So here's a glow node. And what I did was made it sort of like an anamorphic look. So it's that really nice, like sort of like stretched across the frame look. People call it like the J.J. Abrams look, I think now. But it was like done like before that. Just watch The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing, and you'll know what I'm talking about. And then you kind of blur that so that it's not so harsh, and then use a what's called plus operation over the top of it, and you can see that now there's this glow effect that's being applied. Oh, looks like it's rendering there. So um, I'll turn that off, and then on, and then off, and on, and you'll see before and after. So that's that glow effect that's being applied over the top. It makes it look nice and shiny. Then the next thing is what's called a light leak effect. So I basically took the background here, I threw a blur on top of it, then I put a glow operation or a glow node here, and you can see it's kind of like funky, this sort of shape that it makes. So I just blurred the heck out of that guy, and then I plussed that over the top. And to show you a before and after, Here is before and then after. Before, after. So it adds a little bit of like a feeling of the sort of like background brightness, like especially on this frame here, the background brightness sort of like bleeding into like the lens and creating this sort of like glowing effect, and sort of like faking that to make it feel like the object is more in the environment instead of just a, rendered object placed over the top of a background. The next thing that I did was I added a color lookup, and this is where it gets a little bit funky, so hopefully this renders quickly. I'll turn this on, and it will basically change the colors here to sort of match a general look. And this was, again, my attempt to try and get everything to look very similar. Um, it was somewhat successful, but again, all the engines sort of handle everything a little bit differently, so it was difficult to get it to sort of like work well. Let's just give it a second here to calculate. It'll probably be easier for me just to show it to you. Ah, there we go. So there's a little bit of a change in the look there. Let me disable it real quick. And then, oh, come on now. Then enable it. And you can see that there's just sort of a change. And I'll probably just make it easier and just edit it to where you can kind of see the two layers kind of like shifting back and forth, sort of like in post process, so that it makes a little bit more sense there. So the next thing, which depending on your opinion and your point of view, in order to make things look more realistic, you kind of have to dirty things up a bit in CGI to make it look right. If it's too perfect, it's a little bit too obvious that it's a rendering. So you kind of have to dirty things up a bit. So I took this sort of like scratchy lens texture. I resized it to the actual composition, and then I used a plus operation over the top to just sort of create. And I'm going to turn off the lookup table so that it renders a little bit faster, so we can actually see what it looks like. Um, so the idea here, and I'll turn this because it's mixed really low. I'm going to turn this up so you can see it. So you can see that that lens, this like sort of lens dirt, is now applied over the top, and it's a little bit too strong. So I pulled it, down to like a point 0.3 or something like that. Maybe even a 0.03. I can't remember what it was at. I think a 0.03. So it just adds a little bit of that to the overall lens. And you'll see it in the intro video that I do for all these. I animate it on and off because generally if light would hit the lens dirt, it would actually show a lot more. But in this one, I sort of left it out so you guys can see more of the engine itself instead of the, lens dirt compositing effect, because I felt like that wasn't as important. And then, of course, a lens distortion, because lenses have somewhat of a distortion. So I added that, and here's a before and after. You can see this sort of like breathing that's going on. And then, very, very last, and definitely not least, adding a grain over the top. And it doesn't have to be super strong, it just has to be somewhat there, because video and film has grain to it. And with the denoising that we did when we did our renders here, and the background being kind of like a sort of like a perfect sort of render of the background, it's very clean. A grain that's played over the top of all your compositing effects sort of uh like puts it all together. Um, a different way of saying that is, let's say that your background had a grain on it and your foreground element didn't have grain on it. If you rendered that out, you would see a difference between the two. And usually in rendering, or in compositing, if you have a digital effect with grain and then you have a background, what's called a plate with grain, you would generally degrain or blur out those grains, and then you would composite it together and then put a grain over the top. And it kind of like um, gets everything looking nice and uniform with the grain animation. So it feels like it was all done in one shot instead of different elements put together, which is really what it is. And then last, the other last thing that I did was I went into Resolve here, DaVinci Resolve and did a final color pass on everything to make sure that I got the brights and the darks where I kind of wanted them to be, and tried to again make sure that these were a little bit more close to each other in the final comparison. So it sounds like a lot of steps. It kind of is, but when you actually know what's going on, and you're doing the work, it's not as bad as it seems, and it's not as tedious as you might think. I actually enjoy doing this compositing stuff. It's a lot of fun to sort of play with different effects and blend everything together. One thing that I had to do, just a note about this, on the Eevee and Cycles engines, when it got towards the end of the animation, there was a lot of flickering and like weird interlacing issues. So I had to do what's called a frame blend, and here you can see what the frame blend does. It looks kind of like like the shutter speed is too slow on the camera to really like capture everything, and it looks kind of like slow motion or something. What I did was I basically did an animation of a frame blend in those areas, so that it could sort of hide that flickering effect. So you might notice in the final render, at when the rings sort of settle down there, the numbers get a little bit blurred, and that's to sort of hide the flickering effect that was happening. So um, it probably has to do with you can kind of see it here if you look closely at this section, you can kind of see that. So it probably has something to do with how I sampled the colors or something like that. I'm sure somebody's going to point out something that I did wrong with the engine, but it's just an example of how these engines calculate things differently because neither of the other two had this issue. So not exactly sure what caused that at the moment. I could do other tests, but I'm not really gonna deal with that right now. And you can see even Cycles here had a little bit of a flickering issue as well. So now LuxCore, and I'll just put the render that I ended up with on the screen. I did try to use the added light calculation effects that it has, and it's called light tracing. It looks really, really great for a single frame, and then for some reason in the render, for the animation, it just goes crazy and it's very unpredictable. So, not exactly sure if I did something wrong there, but I didn't have the time to rerun another whole animation for that because it does take quite a bit of time to do a full animation. So, not sure what happened there, but that's why the LuxCore final render does not have the added light tracing. So I hope that this really quick, and I'm trying to keep this again as short as possible. I hope that you guys at least understand what I did and the steps that I did, and it sort of piques your interest to get involved in more compositing or just testing your skills a bit and doing other sort of weird abstract animations and stuff like this. And if you'd like to see any specific, details on any of this stuff, like how I did a specific thing in Natron, or if I didn't cover something that you'd like to see me cover more in detail, please leave a comment below. And if you like this video and you like the stuff that's on this channel, please make sure to like and subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And I will see you guys next time on DJ Tutorials. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe, and make sure that you hit the little bell icon to notify you when new videos are uploaded. And I will see you next time on DJ Tutorials.